Hey, and we're back. Yes. Oh, that's right. So we were talking about kind of the eros of the mind and the storytelling between Penelope and Odysseus. And so after he tells her this kind of tall tale, right, of where he's from, right, which is a sort of a lie, but it ignites this kind of passionate response in her. So the poet writes, his lies were like the truth, and as she listened, she began to weep. Her face was melting like the snow that Zephyr scatters across the mountain peaks. Then Eurus thaws it, and as it melts, the rivers swell and flow again. So were her lovely cheeks dissolved with tears. She wept for her own husband, who was right next to her. Right? So here we have a Homeric metaphor of her, her tears like kind of melting her, right? Like, so there's the sense that she has been sort of entombed in ice, like under this kind of icy self control, right? And that finally, when she's near Odysseus and he tells her the story that invokes her lost husband, her heart sort of melts and her face kind of changes, right? And this is what happens to people who are close to their loved ones, right? Their faces change. Their there's a kind of way in which their face is an accurate reflection of their inner life, right? And so these tears are like what's happening in her heart, and for once, the inside and the outside become one, right? And there's no difference between what is in her heart and what is on her face, right? So at this point, another interesting theme emerges from their intimacy, right? Which is that marriage, in some ways, is a competition, right? That married couples do kind of compete, and that there is an element of kind of conflict and competitiveness in the most intimate of marriages, right? And that in some ways that this is an important element, right? That the poem wants us to consider that, these characters are not just simply, cornily kind of like, in love with one another, right? They are sharp-tongued, sharp-elbowed, you might say, right? Sort of jockeying for position, move and counter move. There's a kind of fencing that's going on here between the two characters. And the poem wants us to take note of this, right? On the one hand, it's an accurate reflection of the type of individuals they are, right? Odysseus is this deceiver, right? And so to be his match, then Penelope must also be this sort of female counterpoint. On the other hand, in a more general way, the poem is arguing that the best relationships do have an element of friction in them, right? So that, and it keeps things interesting. It keeps each of the individuals kind of on their toes. And so, yes, there is this kind of overwhelming warmth that characterizes great love, but so friction too, and lovers' quarrels. This type of energy is present in this particular book, and the poet wants us to take note, right? So Penelope's like, all right, knock it off, right? Just tell me where you're from, man. Like, I don't know what's going on with this, right? You're kind of trying to hide it. Just come on out with it, right? No more fairy tales, she says, right? And then, he tells the story and she breaks into tears. And at this point, you can almost sense the poet kind of just overwhelmed himself by this scene of just like, 20 years apart. So many obstacles have been overcome for them to be sitting side by side, and yet they're still not fully able to recognize one another kind of formally, right? And the poet himself, you can almost feel the poet kind of standing back from the scene that he has set and saying, oh my God, this is crazy, right? This is just crazy what's going on here. So yeah, and then at this point, it's fair to ask, does Penelope consciously, partially consciously, subconsciously, whatever, does she kind of recognize Odysseus, right? And there seems to be some indications in the text that she does, right? Um, that the way that she responds to what he's saying and when she starts kind of crying and the level of emotion that is kind of pouring forth from her, right? The degree of intimacy and how much she's trusting him, right? And almost you might think too that just like Odysseus, she's covering her ass a little bit, right? Telling him a story about how she was able to trick the suitors and thereby, right, letting him know she hasn't had sex with any of them, right? She's been sexually faithful throughout, right? So, in a sense, you can see her also kind of strategizing and maneuvering, right? But then there's also this sort of level of emotional intensity that emerges from this conversation between these two that seems, hard to credit a random beggar, even a handsome and intelligent beggar such as Odysseus is, between a beggar and a queen, right? We wonder, could this happen, right? And um, it strains credulity a little bit, right? So by this method, the poet is indicating, perhaps there's something more going on than what appears on the surface of just a queen recognizing this intelligent and sort of noble beggar and giving him a chance to tell his story, right? Maybe there's more going on. And if there is another level to their connection, then this again kind of reinforces this notion of intellectual jousting between equals, right? That gives their connection and their relationship such energy, such crackle, right? Um, so, yes, they are sending one another signals and signs, right? So, she designs a kind of test, which is very Odysseus like, right? For this beggar saying, okay, if you knew my husband, tell me, prove it, right? Tell me something that only someone who knew him would know. And then he, and this is beautiful, right? I love this. He describes a brooch and these kind of keepsakes and mementos, tokens of love that Penelope herself gave him. Right? It's almost too much. So he's like, okay, I'll give you proof. You want proof that I knew your husband? He describes this thing, and then she's like, oh my God, I gave that to him, right? Which of course he knows. So in a sense, he is like kind of reigniting or kind of spurring her emotional response even further, right? And then there's this line where she says, where the poet says, she knew the signs he had planted as evidence, right? So it's like he is leaving breadcrumbs for her to follow, and she knows, or the poet suggests that she might know that he is doing this. And of course, she knows her husband very well. And she knows that this is precisely the type of thing that Odysseus, of all men, would do, right? Would to follow these breadcrumbs towards his warm embrace, right? And so at this point, you can start to see, some of Odysseus's flaws are part of why she loves him. And this is a cliche, but an important point about love, right? And also the way that the poem understands heroism, right? That Odysseus's tendency towards deceit and trickery, are as much a flaw as they are a strength, right? The poem admiringly talks about this deviousness, right? But on the other hand, we see that it costs Odysseus very dearly on a number of occasions. And also, what's so very poignant about this moment is that time has passed, right? And we can see that this man and this woman are no longer what they once were, right? And that they have changed over time. But that the strength of their original connection was such, and their commitment to loving the nature of each other, each other's true nature, was powerful enough that the connection between them remains as vital as it once was, right? And So at this point, you could argue that the poem moves into a kind of contemplation of what it means to love another person deeply and in an enduring way, right? And it's very clear that this is not some sort of Disney fairy tale in terms of what constitutes enduring love, right? The characters are described as devious, as wary, as shrewd, thoughtful, grief stricken, but not mooning over one another in this kind of adolescent, sophomoric, romantic love, right? It's a knowing love, right? And this knowingness does not weaken or in some way obscure the power of the emotional fire that burns within both of them, right? And presumably the physical attraction, the sexual connection between them too, right? Which will be an important part of the poem going forward. However, the poem does say that, or indicates through this book, right, that it is this kind of psychic and emotional and connection of the mind that characterizes this kind of love, that makes it plausible, believable for us, that they would last this long and that they would still love one another as powerfully when they see each other again, right? And so, this is incredibly convincing, and it places you right inside these characters and makes you feel what they feel in these moments. And so I hope you enjoyed this book as much as I did. Thanks a lot.